The fluorescent lights of Riverside General Hospital hummed their familiar tune as Grace Patterson moved through the emergency department with practiced efficiency. At 35, she had perfected the art of appearing calm, while her world spun in controlled chaos. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her light blue scrubs had been carefully selected that morning, loose enough to hide the secret she'd been carrying for 5 months. It was 6:15 on a Tuesday morning in Cedar Falls, Missouri, and Grace was already responding to her second emergency of the shift. The teenage boy on the gurney had wrapped his car around an oak tree on Highway 63, and his injuries were severe enough to make most nurses pause. Not Grace. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had seen it all and refused to let anything shake her. "Vitals are stabilizing," she called out to Dr. Williams as she adjusted the IV drip. "Blood pressure's coming up, and his pupils are responding better." Dr. Williams glanced at her with the kind of respect that took years to earn. "Outstanding work, Grace. I don't know what we'd do without you around here." From across the trauma bay, Nurse Janet Miller nodded in agreement. "She's been incredible lately. Working extra shifts, volunteering for the difficult cases. I swear, Grace, you must run on pure determination." Grace managed a smile while checking the patient's pulse. If only they knew that determination was fueled by necessity, by the growing awareness that she had approximately 4 months to figure out how to be a mother, a nurse, and somehow make ends meet on a single income. The boy's pulse was strong and steady under her fingertips. Another life stabilized. Another small victory in what felt like an increasingly uphill battle. As she leaned forward to check the heart monitor, a sharp sensation jolted through her abdomen. The baby, her daughter according to the ultrasound she'd had in secret, delivered a kick that was both reassuring and startling. Grace's hand instinctively moved toward her stomach before she caught herself, but not before her stethoscope slipped from her other hand, clattering to the floor. "You okay there?" Janet asked, bending to retrieve the fallen instrument. "Just tired," Grace replied quickly, accepting the stethoscope back. But she caught Janet's curious glance and knew she'd have to be more careful. Cedar Falls was a small town, and Riverside General was an even smaller community. Secrets had a way of revealing themselves whether you were ready or not. By 10:30, Grace had helped stabilize 2 more patients and was beginning to feel the familiar exhaustion that had become her constant companion. She was reviewing charts at the nurse's station when a commotion at the main entrance caught her attention. Through the glass doors, she could see a man in work clothes hesitating on the front steps. A yellow hard hat tucked under his arm, something about his posture. The way he ran his free hand through graying brown hair sent a chill down Grace's spine. She knew that gesture, had seen it 1,000 times growing up when her father was nervous or unsure. But it couldn't be him. Tom Patterson hadn't set foot in this hospital since the day her mother died 6 years ago. And he certainly wouldn't be here now. Grace watched as the man finally pushed through the doors and approached the information desk. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking the broad shoulders that had once made her feel safe, the weathered hands that had taught her to tie her shoes and ride a bike. Tom Patterson looked older, more worn down by life and manual labor, but he was unmistakably her father. "Excuse me," she heard him say to the receptionist. His voice carrying the same gravelly tone she remembered from childhood bedtime stories. "I'm here to ask about visiting one of your patients, Jimmy Rodriguez. He was brought in yesterday after a construction accident." The receptionist, Mrs. Hartwell, smiled sympathetically. "Oh yes, Mr. Rodriguez is in room 312. Visiting hours are until 8 tonight. I have to say he's fortunate to be here. We have the most dedicated staff, especially our emergency nurses. That blonde one over there," she gestured toward Grace, "has been working miracles lately. Saved 3 lives yesterday alone." Grace felt her blood turn to ice water. She quickly turned away, hoping to make it to the elevator before Tom noticed her, but she was too late. The soft ding of the elevator arriving seemed to echo through the lobby like a gunshot, and when the doors opened, Grace found herself face to face with the man she hadn't spoken to in 4 years. Tom's brown eyes, so much like her own, widened with recognition and something that might have been pain. The years had aged him more than they should have. His hair was more grey than brown now, and deep lines etched his face, lines that spoke of long days in the sun, and longer nights wrestling with regrets. Grace. Her name came out as barely a whisper. Tom. She couldn't bring herself to call him Dad. That word had lost its meaning somewhere between her mother's funeral and the bitter fight that had followed, when Grace had needed her father most and found only an empty shell of a man who smelled like whiskey and disappointment. They stood in the lobby, surrounded by the familiar sounds of a busy hospital, monitors beeping, phones ringing, the soft murmur of medical conversations, but the silence between them felt deafening. "I heard you were working here," Tom said finally, his voice uncertain. "Jimmy mentioned it when he was conscious yesterday. Said the best nurse in Cedar Falls was taking care of him." Grace straightened her spine, falling back into the professional demeanor that had served as her armor for years. "Mr. Rodriguez is stable. He suffered internal injuries and a concussion, but the surgery went well. He should make a full recovery. Thank you." Tom's relief was evident, but his eyes never left Grace's face. You look good, healthy." The irony of that statement wasn't lost on Grace. She felt anything but healthy these days, running on too little sleep and too much coffee, pushing her body to its limits while carrying a child she wasn't sure she was ready for. But Tom didn't need to know that. Nobody did. "I'm fine," she said, the same automatic response she'd been giving everyone for months. "Just busy. We're always busy here." Tom nodded, and Grace could see him struggling with something, some question or comment he wasn't sure how to voice. The years had built a wall between them that felt insurmountable, constructed brick by brick from hurt feelings and unspoken resentments. "Grace, I know things have been—" Tom started, then stopped, running that familiar hand through his hair again. "I know I haven't been the father you needed, especially after your mom died. I was lost and I handled everything wrong." Grace felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. This was exactly the conversation she'd dreaded for 4 years, the one that could unravel everything she'd worked so hard to build. Her independent life, her successful career, her carefully maintained distance from the pain of her childhood. It all felt fragile suddenly, as breakable as the heart monitor readings she watched all day. "Tom, I can't do this right now," she said, using his first name like a shield. "I have patients to care for, responsibilities. I understand. I just wanted you to know." Grace's pager buzzed insistently against her hip, saving her from whatever Tom had wanted her to know. Emergency in the ER, code blue. Someone's life hung in the balance, and Grace Patterson had never walked away from someone who needed her, even when staying meant facing her own demons. "I have to go," she said, already moving toward the elevator. "Room 312 if you want to see Mr. Rodriguez." As the elevator doors closed between them, Grace caught a glimpse of Tom's face, etched with the same expression of loss and longing she remembered from her mother's funeral. But she couldn't think about that now. Someone needed her medical skills, her steady hands and clear thinking. Someone needed saving, and that was something Grace knew how to do. The emergency was waiting in Trauma Bay 3 when Grace arrived, slightly out of breath from hurrying. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, the town librarian, had collapsed while shelving books in the biography section. At 72, Eleanor was beloved by everyone in Cedar Falls, the kind of woman who remembered every child's favorite book and always had a kind word for the lonely or lost. "Possible stroke," Dr. Williams announced as they worked to stabilize her. "She's responsive but confused. Grace, I need you to monitor her vitals while I assess neurological function." Grace moved into position beside Eleanor's gurney, her practiced hands adjusting monitors and checking IV lines. Despite everything swirling in her personal life, this was where she felt most confident, most capable. In the controlled chaos of emergency medicine, Grace Patterson was exactly who she was meant to be. "Am I at the library?" Eleanor asked weakly, her voice slurred but recognizable. "No, Mrs. Hayes, you're at the hospital." Grace said gently, taking the older woman's hand. "You had a little episode at work, but we're going to take good care of you." "Grace? Grace Patterson? Is that you, dear?" Grace smiled, despite the gravity of the situation. "Yes, ma'am. I'm here. Your mother would be so proud," Eleanor whispered. "You always were going to be something special." Through the glass partition separating the trauma bay from the waiting area, Grace could see Tom watching her work. His expression was unreadable, but something in his posture reminded her of the way he used to stand in the doorway of her childhood bedroom, making sure she was safe before going to bed. The memory hit her unexpectedly, a reminder of the father he'd been, before grief and alcohol had changed everything. Working with the focused intensity that had made her reputation at Riverside General, Grace helped stabilize Eleanor Hayes. The stroke was mild, caught early enough to minimize damage. Another life saved, another family spared the devastating loss Grace knew too well. But as the immediate crisis passed and Eleanor was wheeled away to the stroke unit, exhaustion hit Grace like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the supply cart, waiting for the dizziness to pass, but instead it seemed to intensify. The fluorescent lights overhead suddenly seemed too bright, the beeping of monitors too loud. "Grace!" Dr. Williams' voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" Before she could answer, strong hands caught her as her knees buckled. Tom's face swam into focus above her, creased with worry and something that looked like recognition. "I've got her," he said to Dr. Williams. "I think she needs to sit down." "I'm fine," Grace protested weakly, even as she leaned against Tom's sturdy frame. "Just need a minute." But Tom was already guiding her to a chair in the corner of the trauma bay, his paramedic training evident in the way he assessed her condition. "When's the last time you ate something? Or slept more than a few hours?" "I said I'm fine." Grace tried to stand, but Tom's gentle but firm hand on her shoulder kept her seated. "Grace, I may not have been around much lately, but I spent 15 years as a paramedic. I know exhaustion when I see it, and this is more than just being tired." Their eyes met, and Grace saw something there she hadn't seen in years. Genuine concern. The kind of protective instinct she remembered from childhood, scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks. For a moment the wall between them seemed thinner, more fragile. "Can we go somewhere private to talk?" Tom asked quietly, against her better judgment. Grace found herself nodding. The hospital cafeteria at 1:15 in the afternoon was nearly empty. Just a few scattered staff members grabbing late lunches between shifts. Tom had insisted on buying Grace a sandwich and juice, watching with parental concern as she picked at the food without really eating. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Tom said finally, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Working extra shifts, taking on more than you can handle. Why?" Grace looked up from her untouched sandwich, seeing not the disappointing father who had let her down, but the man who had once taught her to be strong, to take care of others, to never give up. The contradiction was painful. "Since when do you care?" The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but 4 years of hurt feelings couldn't be erased by one moment of concern. Tom flinched as if she'd slapped him. "I've always cared, Grace. I know I haven't shown it well, but I never stopped caring." "You have a funny way of showing it." Grace set down her juice with more force than necessary. "Where were you when I graduated nursing school? When I got this job? When I needed help moving apartments? When I—" She stopped herself before saying, "When I found out I was pregnant and the father walked out." Some secrets were still too raw to share, even in anger. "When you what?" Tom leaned forward, his brown eyes intense with the kind of focus she remembered from childhood, when he'd given her his complete attention while she told him about her day or shared her dreams. "Nothing." "It doesn't matter." "It does matter. You matter." Tom's voice was rough with emotion. "I know I failed you after your mom died. I know I wasn't the father you needed when grief was eating me alive. But I never stopped loving you, and I never stopped worrying about you." Grace felt tears threatening and forced them back. She couldn't afford to break down. Not here, not now. "Love and worry don't pay bills, Tom. They don't show up when you need them." "You're right. The simple admission caught Grace off guard. I was selfish. I was drowning in my own pain, and I let you drown too. But I'm trying to be better now. I've been sober for 2 years. Grace looked at him with new eyes, noticing details she'd missed before. The clearness in his gaze, the steadiness of his hands, the way he carried himself with something approaching dignity again. 2 years. Started the day I realized I'd missed your 30th birthday. Realized I'd let alcohol steal 5 years of my life and cost me the only family I had left. The confession hung between them, heavy with implications Grace wasn't ready to process. Her pager buzzed again. Another emergency. Another chance to focus on someone else's crisis instead of her own. I have to go, she said, standing too quickly and immediately regretting it as the world tilted sideways. Grace, I have to go, she repeated more firmly this time, and walked away before Tom could see the tears she was no longer able to hold back. The third emergency of Grace's day was 7-year-old Danny Martinez, brought in by frantic parents after a playground accident that had resulted in a broken arm and possible concussion. Children were always the hardest cases, their pain seeming to echo louder in the sterile hospital environment, their fear more piercing than any adult's suffering. It hurts, Danny sobbed as Grace gently examined his arm. I want my mommy. Your mommy's right here, sweetheart, Grace said soothingly, nodding to Maria Martinez, who hovered anxiously beside the gurney. And we're going to make the hurt go away, okay? But I need you to be very brave for me. Danny's father, Carlos, paced the small trauma bay like a caged animal. He fell from the top of the monkey bars. Just slipped and fell. I should have been watching more carefully. Accidents happen, Mr. Martinez, Grace assured him while preparing Danny for x-rays. What matters is that you got him here quickly. Dr. Williams is going to take some pictures of Danny's arm so we can see exactly what needs to be fixed. Grace worked with the gentle efficiency that had made her beloved among Cedar Falls parents. She had a gift with children, an ability to calm their fears and ease their pain that seemed almost magical. What she didn't realize was that Tom was watching from the corridor, seeing his daughter's natural maternal instincts in action. Miss Grace is the best nurse in the whole world, Danny announced solemnly as she finished bandaging his arm after the x-rays revealed a clean break that would heal beautifully. She makes everything better. She certainly does, Maria Martinez agreed, squeezing Grace's hand gratefully. Thank you for taking such good care of our boy. As the Martinez family prepared to leave with Danny's arm properly casted and his spirits restored by a superhero-themed sling, Grace felt the familiar satisfaction that came from a job well done. But the satisfaction was immediately followed by a wave of exhaustion so profound it made her lean against the wall for support. 3 emergencies in one day, each life saved, each family kept intact. She should have felt triumphant, but instead she felt hollowed out, as if all her energy had been poured into other people, with nothing left for herself. Grace. Tom's voice behind her was gentle but urgent. You need to sit down. I'm okay, she said automatically, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true. The hallway seemed to be tilting, the fluorescent lights growing dim around the edges. No, you're not. Tom's strong arms caught her just as her legs gave out completely. The last thing Grace remembered was the familiar scent of his cologne, unchanged after all these years, and the sound of him calling for Dr. Williams. When Grace woke up, she was lying in a hospital bed for the second time in her life. The first being when she'd had her tonsils out at age 8. The irony of the situation, the caregiver becoming the patient, wasn't lost on her, but it was overshadowed by the panic that flooded through her as she realized where she was. Tom was sitting in the chair beside her bed, his work-worn hands clasped tightly in his lap, his expression a mixture of worry and something that looked like dawning understanding. How long was I out? Grace asked, struggling to sit up. About 20 minutes. Dr. Williams ran some tests. Tom's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes were searching her face with the intensity of someone putting together pieces of a puzzle. Grace, When's the last time you had a full medical checkup? The question sent alarm bells ringing in Grace's head. I'm fine. I just need some rest. You're not fine. Dr. Williams appeared in the doorway, chart in hand and expression serious. Grace, we need to talk about what happened today. Your blood pressure is elevated. You're showing signs of severe exhaustion, and your blood work indicates... Doctor, Grace interrupted, her voice sharp with warning. She couldn't let him say it, not in front of Tom, not when she wasn't ready. But Dr. Williams either didn't catch her signal or chose to ignore it. Grace, you're pregnant, and based on your condition today, you've been pushing yourself far beyond what's safe for both you and your baby. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, changing everything in the span of a few syllables. Grace watched Tom's face transform as the information sank in, seeing surprise give way to confusion and then to something that might have been hurt. Pregnant? Tom's voice was barely a whisper. Grace, how, when... 5 months, Grace admitted, her defiance crumbling in the face of her father's obvious shock. I'm 5 months along, and the father... Grace turned her face away, unable to meet Tom's eyes. Gone. He left when I told him. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions and accusations. Grace could practically hear Tom's thoughts, could imagine him wondering how his daughter had ended up in this situation, alone and afraid and too proud to ask for help. Why didn't you tell me? Tom asked finally, his voice rough with emotion. Grace laughed bitterly. Tell you when? You haven't returned a phone call in 4 years. You missed Christmas, my birthday, every holiday that mattered. Why would I think you'd care about this? Because it's my grandchild, Tom said simply, and something in his voice made Grace finally look at him. Because you're my daughter, and no matter how badly I've screwed things up, I love you. I've always loved you. Tears that Grace had been holding back for months finally spilled over. I was scared, she whispered. I'm 35 years old, and I was scared to tell my own father I was going to have a baby. Tom stood up slowly, as if testing whether his legs would support him. Would it be okay if I sat closer? Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. Tom moved to sit on the edge of her bed, close enough to take her hand in both of his. I know I haven't earned the right to be part of this, he said quietly. I know I failed you when you needed me most, after your mom died. But if you'll let me, I want to try to be better. I want to help. I don't know how to let people help me, Grace admitted. I've been doing everything alone for so long, then we'll figure it out together, one day at a time. For the first time in years, Grace felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe some bridges could be rebuilt, some relationships healed. Maybe her daughter wouldn't grow up the way Grace had, feeling like she had to carry the world on her shoulders alone. But before either of them could say anything else, a nurse appeared in the doorway with news that would test every fragile thread of connection they'd just begun to weave. Mr. Patterson. The nurse's expression was sympathetic but grave. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development with Mr. Rodriguez. He's asking for you, specifically. His condition it's taken a turn. Grace watched her father's face change, saw the familiar war between duty and personal desire play out in his expression. This was the test, she realized. Would Tom choose to stay with her, or would he once again find a reason to leave when things got difficult? Tom looked between Grace and the nurse, his internal struggle visible to anyone who cared to look. Can you give me just a moment? He asked the nurse, who nodded and stepped back into the hallway. Go, Grace said quietly, even though the word felt like swallowing glass. Jimmy needs you. Grace, go, she repeated more firmly. I understand. I've always understood. Tom hesitated for a moment longer, then leaned down and pressed a gentle hand to Grace's forehead. I'll be back, he promised. We're not finished talking about this. But as Grace watched him walk away, she felt the familiar hollow ache of abandonment settling back into her chest. Some patterns were too old and too deep to change, no matter how much you wanted them to. Tom Patterson was still the man who left when things got complicated, and Grace was still the woman who watched him go, alone in her hospital room, Grace placed both hands on her growing belly and whispered an apology to her unborn daughter. "I'm sorry, baby girl. I thought maybe this time would be different. I thought maybe your grandfather might actually stick around." But even as she said the words, Grace knew she was being unfair. Tom hadn't chosen to leave this time. He'd been called away by duty, by loyalty to a friend who was dying. It was exactly the kind of moral dilemma her mother would have navigated with grace and understanding. The thought of her mother brought a fresh wave of grief and longing. Catherine Patterson would have known what to do, would have found a way to bridge the gap between father and daughter, would have made everything make sense. But Catherine was gone, had been gone for 6 years, and Grace was left to figure out how to be a daughter, a mother, and a woman all on her own. Dr. Williams returned an hour later to discuss Grace's condition and the changes she needed to make. Bed rest, reduced hours, better nutrition, less stress. All things that sounded wonderful in theory, but seemed impossible given her financial situation and her stubborn independence. "Grace, I'm going to be frank with you," Dr. Williams said, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "You're risking your health and your baby's health by continuing at this pace. Your body is telling you to slow down. You need to listen." "I can't afford to slow down," Grace replied honestly. "I need the overtime, the extra shifts. I'm going to be raising this baby alone." "Hugh?" Dr. Williams glanced toward the door. "Because it seems like your father is genuinely concerned." Grace shook her head. "Tom's good at being concerned. He's not so good at following through. Maybe this time is different." "Maybe," Grace conceded, but she didn't believe it. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when she had a child, depending on her to be strong, reliable, and completely self-sufficient. It was nearly 9 o'clock when Tom finally returned to Grace's room. His face was drawn with grief and exhaustion, and Grace knew without asking that Jimmy Rodriguez hadn't made it. Tom had lost another friend, another reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of the time we have. "I'm sorry about Jimmy," Grace said softly as Tom sank into the chair beside her bed. "He was a good man. Worked construction for 30 years, never missed a day unless he was sick. Had 4 grandchildren who adored him." Tom rubbed his face with both hands. His last words were about not taking family for granted. Grace felt the weight of those words, the guilt and regret they represented. "Tom, I know what you're thinking," he interrupted. "You're thinking this is just like before, when your mom was dying and I couldn't handle it, couldn't be strong enough to stay and face it with you, isn't it?" Tom looked at her with eyes that held more pain than anger. "Maybe it was. But Jimmy made me realize something tonight. He said he regretted every argument with his kids that he let fester, every holiday he missed because of pride or stubbornness, every chance he had to say, 'I love you,' and chose silence instead. Tom, I don't want to have those regrets about you. Grace, about my grandchild." Tom leaned forward in his chair, his voice urgent with sincerity. "I know I haven't earned the right to be part of your life. I know I left you when you needed me most, and I can't undo that. But I'm asking you to give me a chance to do better." Grace studied her father's face, looking for signs of the weakness that had driven him away before. Instead, she saw determination, the kind of quiet strength she remembered from her childhood, before grief and alcohol had worn it away. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to help you raise this baby. I want to be the grandfather Jimmy never got to be because he waited too long to fix things with his family." Tom's voice grew stronger with each word. "I'm saying I'm done running away from the people I love." Grace felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "I don't know how to trust you again." "Then don't, not right away. Let me earn it back one day at a time." Tom reached for her hand, holding it gently in both of his. "Let me help you, Grace, please." For the first time in years, Grace allowed herself to consider the possibility that she didn't have to face everything alone. The idea was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. "The baby's a girl," she said quietly, the first piece of information she'd shared willingly. Tom's face transformed with wonder and joy. "A girl? My granddaughter?" Grace nodded, surprised by how good it felt to share this secret she'd been carrying alone for so long. "I haven't picked a name yet. I kept thinking I had time, but now you realize how quickly everything can change," Tom finished. "I know that feeling." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both lost in thoughts about the future and the fragile new connection they were trying to build. Outside Grace's window, the lights of Cedar Falls twinkled in the darkness, a small town full of families trying to figure out how to love each other despite their flaws and failures. "Tom," Grace said finally, "I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of being a terrible mother. Of messing up this little girl the way we got messed up." Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "Of repeating all the same mistakes." Tom squeezed her hand gently. "The fact that you're worried about it tells me you're going to be a wonderful mother. And you won't be doing it alone, not if I have anything to say about it." Grace wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this time would be different. But trust was something that had to be built slowly, carefully, like the delicate bond between parent and child. "I should probably try to get some sleep," she said. "Dr. Williams wants to keep me overnight for observation." Tom nodded and started to stand, but Grace's hand on his arm stopped him. Would you mind staying a little longer? I don't really want to be alone right now." Tom settled back into his chair with a smile that reminded Grace of bedtime stories and goodnight hugs, of the father he'd been before everything fell apart. "I'll stay as long as you want me to," he promised. The next morning brought weak autumn sunlight through Grace's hospital room window and the tentative beginning of something that might eventually become healing. Tom had spent the night in the uncomfortable chair, insisting he was fine when Grace offered to call him a cab. Dr. Williams arrived with Grace's discharge papers and a serious conversation about the changes she needed to make. Reduced work schedule, regular prenatal appointments, better nutrition, and most importantly, accepting help when it was offered. "I've arranged for you to take a week off work," Dr. Williams said, holding up a hand when Grace started to protest. "Doctor's orders, not a request. Your body needs time to recover, and you need time to figure out a more sustainable schedule." As they prepared to leave the hospital together, Grace felt a strange mixture of anxiety and anticipation. For the first time in 4 years, she wasn't walking through life completely alone. It was a foreign feeling, like learning to trust a muscle that had been injured and was slowly healing. "Grace," Tom said as they reached his truck in the parking lot, "I know this is all new, trying to rebuild what we had, but I want you to know I meant what I said. I'm not going anywhere." Grace looked at her father, seeing not the broken man who had disappointed her so many times, but the man who had driven her to school every day, who had taught her to change a tire and balance a checkbook, who had once been her hero before life had proven him to be human. "I want to believe that," she said honestly, "but it's going to take time." "I have time," Tom replied simply. "All the time in the world." As they drove through the familiar streets of Cedar Falls toward Grace's apartment, she found herself thinking about the 3 lives she'd saved the day before. The teenage boy from the car accident, Mrs. Hayes, the librarian, little Danny Martinez with his broken arm. Each of them would go home to families who loved them, who would celebrate their recovery and hold them a little closer. Grace had spent her entire adult life saving other people's families, while her own remained broken and scattered. But maybe it wasn't too late to save her own family, too. Maybe healing was possible, even after years of hurt and disappointment. "Tom," she said as they pulled into her apartment complex, "would you like to come up? I could make some coffee and we could talk about things, about the future." Tom's face lit up with hope and gratitude. "I'd like that very much." As they climbed the stairs to Grace's second-floor apartment, she felt her daughter move inside her, a gentle reminder of the future they were all walking toward together. 3 generations connected by blood and love, and the possibility of second chances. Grace Patterson had saved 3 lives the day before, while carrying one inside her. But as she unlocked her apartment door and invited her father into her home, she realized that maybe, Just maybe, she was finally learning how to save her own life too. The afternoon sunlight streaming through Grace's living room window caught the dust motes dancing in the air and illuminated the small space she'd made into a home. Tom stood awkwardly in the doorway, taking in the neat bookshelves, the framed photos of Grace's nursing school graduation, the comfortable furniture that spoke of a life carefully built through hard work and determination. "It's nice," he said, and Grace could hear the pride in his voice. "You've done well for yourself." Grace moved carefully to the kitchen, still mindful of Dr. Williams' warnings about taking things easy. "It's not much, but it's mine." "Sometimes that's all we need," Tom replied, settling onto the couch at Grace's invitation. "A place that's ours, where we can figure out what comes next." As Grace prepared coffee, she found herself stealing glances at her father, still adjusting to his presence in her carefully ordered world. For 4 years, this apartment had been her sanctuary, the place where she could let down her guard and stop being strong for everyone else. Having Tom here felt strange, vulnerable, like opening a door she'd kept locked for so long she'd almost forgotten how. "Grace," Tom said quietly, "I know this is awkward having me here. If you'd rather I left—" "No," Grace said quickly, surprising herself with the firmness of her response. "Don't leave. Not yet." They sat together in Grace's living room, drinking coffee and navigating the careful territory of rebuilding a relationship that had been broken for so long. Tom talked about his construction work, about the 2 years of sobriety, about the small apartment he'd rented on the other side of town. Grace shared stories about her patience, about the satisfaction she found in her work, about the dreams she'd had to put on hold when Marcus had walked out of her life. "Tell me about him," Tom said gently. "About the father." Grace set down her coffee cup with hands that weren't quite steady. "His name was Marcus. We met at a medical conference in Kansas City. He was a pharmaceutical rep, charming, successful. We dated for 8 months before I got pregnant. And when you told him, he said he wasn't ready to be a father, that his career was just taking off and he couldn't handle the responsibility." Grace's voice was matter-of-fact, but Tom could hear the hurt underneath. "He offered to pay for other options. When I refused, he said he couldn't be part of it." Tom's jaw tightened with anger, but he kept his voice gentle. "That must have been devastating." "It was." Grace looked out the window, watching the late afternoon light fade over Cedar Falls. "But in some ways, it was a blessing. Better to find out who he really was before the baby came." "You're going to be a wonderful mother," Tom said with quiet conviction. "I've seen you with patience with children. You have a gift for caring, for making people feel safe." Grace felt tears threatening again. "I don't feel like I have any gifts right now. I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water." "That's what being a parent feels like sometimes," Tom said, his voice heavy with memory. "Your mother felt the same way when you were born. We both did. But love finds a way to make you stronger than you thought possible." The mention of her mother brought a familiar ache to Grace's chest. Catherine Patterson had been the glue that held their family together, the steady presence who had made everything make sense. Without her, Tom had fallen apart, and Grace had been left to navigate young adulthood without the guidance she desperately needed. "I miss her," Grace whispered. "Every day, but especially now. She would have known what to do about everything. She would have been so excited about becoming a grandmother." Tom said softly. "She always wanted more children, but after you, the doctors said it wasn't safe." Grace looked at her father with new understanding. "Is that why you wanted me to have siblings so badly? Why you were always disappointed that I was an only child?" "Not disappointed. Never disappointed in you." Tom's voice was firm. "But yes, I think your mum and I both felt the weight of you being our only child. We put too much pressure on ourselves to be perfect parents. And when your mom got sick, you fell apart," Grace finished gently. "I fell apart," Tom agreed. "And I left you to pick up the pieces alone. That's something I'll regret for the rest of my life." They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in memories of Catherine Patterson, her laugh, her wisdom, her ability to make even the hardest days feel manageable. Grace placed a hand on her growing belly, wondering what her mother would have thought about becoming a grandmother, about the legacy of love and loss that was being passed down through generations. "Tom," Grace said finally, "if you really want to be part of this, part of raising this baby, there are things we need to talk about. Rules we need to establish." Tom nodded seriously. "Whatever you need. I need to know you're not going to disappear again when things get hard. Because they will get hard. Babies don't sleep. They cry at all hours. They need constant attention. And if you're going to be part of her life, you need to be all in, not just when it's convenient." "I understand." "Do you?" Grace's voice sharpened with the intensity of her need to be heard. "Because I can't do this halfway, Tom. I can't have my daughter wondering why her grandfather promises to be there and then doesn't show up. I can't have her feeling the way I felt when you missed my high school graduation because you were too drunk to drive." The accusation hung between them, sharp and painful, but necessary. Tom absorbed it without flinching, accepting the truth of what he'd done to his relationship with his daughter. "You're right to be cautious," he said finally. "I've given you every reason not to trust me. But Grace, I swear to you on your mother's memory, I'm not the same man who let you down before. Sobriety changed me. Losing Jimmy last night reminded me what really matters. I will not disappear on you or on my granddaughter." Grace studied her father's face, looking for any sign of the weakness or uncertainty that had characterized him during his drinking years. Instead, she saw determination, the kind of quiet resolve she remembered from her childhood before grief had broken him. "Okay," she said quietly. "But if you ever—" "I won't," Tom interrupted gently but firmly. "I won't let either of you down." As evening settled over Cedar Falls, Grace found herself feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope of someone drowning, but the gentle, growing hope of someone who had found solid ground beneath her feet. "I should probably let you get some rest," Tom said, as the sun began to set outside Grace's window. "Dr. Williams said you need to take it easy." Grace nodded, though she was surprised to find she didn't want him to leave. After years of solitude, the companionship felt foreign but welcome. "Thank you for staying with me today, for everything." Tom stood to go, then paused at the door. "Grace, would it be okay if I came by tomorrow? Maybe we could start making some plans, figuring out what you're going to need for the baby." "I'd like that," Grace said, and meant it. After Tom left, Grace sat in her quiet apartment, one hand resting on her growing belly. For the first time since learning she was pregnant, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't involve doing everything alone. A future where her daughter would have a grandfather who loved her, where Grace might have the support she'd been too proud to ask for. The baby kicked gently against her palm, as if responding to the shift in Grace's emotional state. "What do you think, little one?" Grace whispered. "Should we give Grandpa Tom a chance?" The response was another gentle flutter, which Grace chose to interpret as approval. The next few weeks passed in a blur of cautious rebuilding and tentative hope. Tom proved true to his word, showing up every day to help Grace prepare for the baby's arrival. He painted the spare bedroom a soft yellow, assembled the crib with the patience of a man who had learned not to rush important things, and drove Grace to every prenatal appointment. At first, Grace waited for him to disappoint her, to find some excuse to pull back when the reality of impending grandparenthood became too overwhelming. But Tom remained steady, reliable in a way she'd forgotten he could be. "The baby's measuring perfectly," Dr. Williams announced during Grace's 30-week appointment. "Heart rate is strong, growth is on track. You're doing much better now that you're taking care of yourself." Grace glanced at Tom, who was sitting in the corner of the examination room with a look of wonder on his face as they listened to his granddaughter's heartbeat through the monitor. "It's really her," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "My granddaughter. Would you like to see her?" Dr. Williams asked, positioning the ultrasound wand on Grace's belly. The image that appeared on the screen was grainy but unmistakable. A tiny person with perfectly formed features, sucking her thumb with the unconscious contentment of the unborn. "She's beautiful," Tom breathed, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Grace, she's absolutely beautiful." Grace felt her own tears starting as she watched her father fall in love with his granddaughter. This was what she'd been missing, she realized. The joy of shared anticipation, the comfort of not being alone in her wonder and worry. "Have you thought about names?" Tom asked as they drove home from the appointment. "I've been considering Catherine," Grace said quietly. "After Mom." Tom had to pull over to the side of the road, overcome by emotion. "She would have loved that," he managed. "She would have been so proud of you, Grace. So proud of the woman you've become. The mother you're going to be." "I'm scared," Grace admitted. The fear she'd been carrying for months finally finding voice. "What if I can't do it? What if I mess her up the way we got messed up?" Tom turned in his seat to face her fully. "Do you know what your mother used to say when you were little, and I worried about the same thing?" Grace shook her head. "She used to say that love doesn't make us perfect parents, but it makes us good enough. And Grace, you have so much love to give. I've seen it every day at the hospital, the way you care for your patients, the way you put everyone else's needs before your own. Catherine, little Catherine, is going to be the luckiest little girl in the world." Grace felt something shift inside her, a settling of fear and a rising of confidence. Maybe Tom was right. Maybe love really was enough. 2 months later, on a snowy February morning that transformed Cedar Falls into a winter wonderland, Catherine Grace Patterson made her entrance into the world. She arrived 3 weeks early, as if impatient to meet the family who'd been preparing for her with such care and anticipation. Tom paced the hospital waiting room like an expectant father rather than grandfather, wearing a path in the linoleum with his nervous energy. When Dr. Williams finally emerged from the delivery room with news, Tom's face transformed with joy and relief. "She's perfect," the doctor announced. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, and absolutely beautiful. Grace did wonderfully. Tom was the first person besides the medical staff to hold Catherine, and Grace would never forget the look on his face as he cradled his granddaughter for the first time. Years of grief, regret, and missed opportunities seemed to melt away as he gazed down at the tiny person who represented hope and second chances. "Hello, sweetheart," Tom whispered to Catherine, who had stopped fussing the moment she was placed in his arms. "I'm your grandpa, and I'm going to love you forever." Grace watched from her hospital bed, exhausted but filled with a peace she hadn't felt in years. This was what family was supposed to look like. 3 generations connected by love and commitment, by the willingness to forgive past mistakes and build something better together. "She looks like you did as a baby," Tom said, gently transferring Catherine back to Grace's waiting arms. Same blonde hair, same serious expression, like she's already trying to figure out how the world works. Grace studied her daughter's tiny face, seeing traces of herself, of Tom, of the mother she'd lost but would never forget. "She's going to know she's loved," Grace said with quiet determination. "She's never going to doubt that she belongs, that she's wanted." "No," Tom agreed, his voice steady with promise. "She'll never have to doubt that." As the winter sun set outside the hospital windows, casting long shadows across the room where 3 generations of Pattersons were finally together, Grace felt a deep sense of completion. She had saved 3 lives the day she collapsed, the teenager Mrs. Hayes, little Danny Martinez. But in the months that followed, she had discovered that sometimes the most important life to save is your own. Catherine Grace Patterson would grow up knowing her grandfather's love, would learn from his mistakes as well as his wisdom, would understand that families can break and heal and grow stronger in the broken places. She would know that her mother was a woman who saved lives for a living, who had learned to accept help when it was offered, who had discovered that love multiplied rather than divided when it was shared. And on quiet evenings, when Grace rocked her daughter to sleep, she would sometimes whisper stories about the grandmother Catherine had never met, but whose love lived on, in the careful way Tom sang lullabies, in the gentle way Grace tended to those who needed healing, in the unbreakable bond that connected them all across time and loss, and the infinite capacity of the human heart to begin again. The light Grace carried, in her work, in her heart, in her hands as she held her daughter, was no longer something she bore alone. It was shared now, passed down and forward, illuminating not just the lives she touched as a nurse, but the family she had helped rebuild from the scattered pieces of grief and regret. In the end, Grace Patterson had learned the most important lesson of all, that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not saving others, but allowing yourself to be saved. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments so you don't miss the next episodes. See you in the next story.